Hi dear students, welcome to Sriram's IAS. I'm Kavita. I will be teaching Anthropology optional for Sriram's IAS on Unacademy platform. In this lecture, we shall be discussing a very interesting topic in paper 2 Anthropology, that is Great Tradition and Little Tradition. Before we begin our discussion on the topic, I just want to give you some important information. That is, we are going to begin our comprehensive batch on Anthropology optional by Sriram's IAS on 19th of June 2023. So in case you haven't enrolled until now, you can enroll now. Also, we have a Mission 1 Year UPSC Civil Services Examination 2024 batch which begins on June 22nd. Further, presently you are also having a limited period offer of flat 25% on all UPSC Civil Services Examination subscriptions. So consider this if you are taking an admission right now. And you can also use the code Srirams, SRIRAMS, which has been mentioned in this. Fine. Now coming on to the discussion on today's topic, that is Great Tradition and Little Tradition. Tradition. Tradition, what do we mean by tradition? Traditions are the practices, beliefs, rituals which we have been following since a very long period of time, isn't it? Wearing sari is a tradition, wearing bindi is a tradition, lighting a lamp while starting or beginning any new occasion or any event, be it an auspicious occasion in office, college, or anywhere. Whenever we are going to begin a new program or an occasion or an event, we begin by lighting a lamp, isn't it? That is a tradition. So there are various traditions which we follow in our day-to-day life. Going and visiting our places of worship, praying, all of this is a tradition, right? So we very well know what we mean by tradition. When we say a person is traditional, we know what we mean by that. So you must have been quite familiar with this term called as tradition. However, you might be little confused about what is this called as great tradition, what is this little tradition. We know the traditions have been followed and we have learned it from our previous generations and we will also be transmitting it to our future generations. But we haven't ever come across this term called as great tradition or little tradition. So you must be curious to know what it is about, right? Definitely, that is what we shall be discussing now. The concept of great and little tradition was first used by Robert Redfield in the study of the Mexican communities in his book Peasant Society and Culture. Robert Redfield went to Mexico and he got interested in the Mexican culture and he worked a lot for the revival of the Mexican culture, and during this time he wrote his famous book called as Peasant Society and Culture. In this book he mentions about little communities. Keep in mind, nowhere does he speak about traditions or great tradition. Robert Redfield was interested in the revival of the Mexican culture, and while studying the Mexican culture, he gave the concept of little communities. So, by little communities, what he referred to? He referred to those villages which were relatively isolated, self-sufficient, and had a very tiny population. Okay, so while studying the Mexican communities, he observed that there were villages which had very tiny population, they were self-sufficient, and they were relatively isolated. He termed these communities, that is these villages, as little communities. So Robert Redfield spoke about the little communities, that is the small villages which were self-sufficient, which were very tiny in size and which were isolated. These he termed as little communities in his book peasant society and culture. However, Robert Redfield never spoke about traditions or great traditions or little tradition. Then why do we say this concept was given by Robert Redfield? I'll tell you now. So it was Mick Kim Marriott and Milton Singer. These two anthropologists who were doing extensive village studies in various villages of India, and they were influenced by the concept of little communities given by Robert Redfield. What Milton Singer and Mickey Marriott did was they applied the concept of little communities given by Robert Redfield when he studied the Mexican culture, and they applied this concept to the Indian context. Got it? So Robert Redfield did the study among the Mexican villages and he gave the concept of little communities. Later, when Milton Singer and Mickey Marriott were studying the Indian villages, they extended the concept of little communities given by Robert Redfield to the Indian context. Okay, they elaborated the original model of Robert Redfield in the light of the data generated from the Indian villages, and they applied that concept of little community to the Indian context and they called it as little tradition and great tradition. Okay, I hope you are not getting confused. Robert Redfield, while studying the Mexican communities, gave us the concept of little communities in his book Peasant Society and Culture. Later, this concept was extended to the Indian context by Milton Singer and Mickey Marriott when they were doing extensive village studies in India, and they gave us the concept of little tradition and great tradition. So, the concept of little communities was extended to Indian context as little tradition and great tradition. So, what is great tradition? What is little tradition? Great traditions are the ones which are concerned with allied thinking. Great traditions are said to have their origin in religious epics, and they have a wide reach, that is they have a national character. So you can find that great tradition elements can be found throughout the length and breadth of the country, and also the great traditions have clear cut norms, rituals and practices, and it is concerned with the allied thinking, and it does not have any ambiguity whatsoever. It is unambiguous and it has been mentioned in the great religious texts like the Puranas, the Sanskritic works, the Brahmanas, the original religious epics, and so on. Okay, so what are the great traditions? The great traditions are mostly mentioned in the religious texts or religious epics, in the Brahmanas, in the Puranas, in the Sanskritic literature, in all these places, and it is concerned with allied thinking. So it is the allied people who follow the great tradition, and they have a wide range. That is, you can find the great tradition elements throughout the length and breadth of the country. That is, they have a national character. At the same time, they are also unambiguous because they have clear cut definitions, norms, practices, and rituals, and they have been clearly mentioned in the written text and they have been transmitted across generations through these written texts. Now, on the other hand, what are little traditions? Little traditions are oral traditions. You cannot find any mention of these little tradition elements in any of the religious epics. So, as the name suggests, little tradition has very limited reach. You can find little tradition in very few communities in particular regions alone. You cannot find little traditions being practiced throughout the length and breadth of the country. Okay, it has very limited reach, and the allied people or the people who follow the great tradition consider the little tradition as mere superstitions because they do not have any logic or they do not have any rationality. So the people concerned with elite thinking and the people who follow great tradition consider the little tradition as superstitions, and the little traditions are mostly followed by the folk people, the rural people, the peasant society in large. Okay, so now did you get a differentiation between what is great tradition and little tradition? So great tradition has been mentioned in the original religious epics, whereas you cannot find any such mention of little tradition in any religious epics or in the Brahmanas or in the Puranas or any Sanskritic literature. The great tradition can be found to be practiced by the elite people throughout the length and breadth of the country. That is, they have a wide reach, they have a national character. So, you can, whereas on the other hand, the little tradition are followed by the folk people, the rural people, and the peasant society, and they have a very limited reach. That is, in a very tiny region, and within few communities alone, you can find this practice of little tradition. Then again, the great tradition have clear-cut norms and rituals and character, whereas the little traditions are considered as mere superstitions by the greater tradition people because they do not have any clear-cut norms, neither rituals, and they do not have any logic or they do not have any rationality on the basis of which they exist. That is why the greater tradition people consider the little tradition as mere superstition and belief and nothing more than that. Whereas the great tradition is unambiguous, it is clear cut, it has been mentioned in the religious epics. Got it? So let me explain to you further with the help of examples. So also the great tradition is cultivated in schools and temples. However, little tradition is transmitted through oral tradition. So from one generation to another through oral, that is by reciting, by teaching your next generation orally, the tradition gets transmitted in the case of little tradition. Whereas in great tradition, it is being cultivated in schools and temples and it is present in the religious texts and it is transmitted like this. Okay, and the great traditions are consciously cultivated and they are handed down by the philosopher, theologian, and the literary man. On the other hand, the little traditions are just taught from one generation to the next generation by oral, that is by repeating, by teaching the next generation, and they are just taken for granted and they are not subjected to much scrutiny. Got it? So the differences between great tradition and little tradition. Now let me explain to you with the examples so that you understand much better. So the very good example for great tradition is Dasara celebration, right? So you can see that Dasara celebration has been mentioned in our religious epics, and you can find Dasara is a huge festival celebrated by people across the entire country, isn't it? No matter whether you belong to north or east, south, west, whichever part of the country you belong to, you can find that this is a huge festival which is celebrated across the length and breadth of the country. It has been mentioned in the religious texts, right? And it is unambiguous. There are clear-cut norms as to how we have to celebrate this festival. So the Dasara celebration is a very good example of great tradition. Same is the case of worshipping of Lord Shiva or worshipping of Lord Ganesh, which we do on Ganesh Chaturthi, and worshipping of Lord Shiva, which we again have Shivaratri, which comes around February, right? February, March, this time of the year, we have this huge festival called as Shivaratri. You can find again this festival is celebrated throughout the length and breadth of the country. It has been mentioned in the religious text. It is unambiguous and it is taught from one generation to the other, right? So these are very good examples of great tradition. So like this, you can witness so many great traditions in your life. Now coming to little tradition. One example of little tradition is the cheek and tongue piercing ceremony, which is carried out in Lord Subramanya temple. So if you ever happen to visit Tamil Nadu, they have this festival for Lord Subramanya, during which the devotees, that is the devotees, take a tiny, tiny trishul and they pierce it in their tongue or in their cheek or even in their back, right? So this is a native, this is a festival, and this is a ritual, this is a tradition which you can follow or which you can witness only in the state of Tamil Nadu and in few regions in other, in a few places in other states also. Like say, for example, you can witness this festival being celebrated in Bangalore also, but not on a huge scale. But in certain temples, you can witness this. In similarly, even in Delhi, there is one temple where they practice this tradition. So you can see that though this is a tradition which is practiced um, in which is very popular, however, it has not been mentioned in any religious text, right? You cannot find this tradition being practiced throughout the length and breadth of the country, and there is no proper rules or proper norms as to how it is celebrated. So this is a regional tradition, you can say. So this is limited only to Tamil Nadu and few parts of the other states. So this is a very good example of little tradition. It does not have a wide reach. It does not have a national character. It has not been mentioned in any religious epics. So this is a very good example of little tradition. Same is the case with Jallikattu. Jallikattu is a tradition which is being followed in Tamil Nadu. I hope you all know very well what Jallikattu is, right? It is celebrated after Pongal in the state of Tamil Nadu, where the young men will try to bring the bull under control, under their control. So this is a sport which has been practiced. It is a tradition which has been practiced in Tamil Nadu, and there were a lot of protests also which happened recently, some 5 6 years ahead, 5 6 years ago. So we all know very well about Jallikattu. So Jallikattu is a tradition which is exclusive to the state of Tamil Nadu, but you cannot but you cannot see this practice or this tradition in any other part of the country, right? So this is a very good example of little tradition. So now I think after we discuss the examples, you got a clear picture of what exactly we mean by great tradition and what we mean by little tradition. Saraswati preferred to call these great traditions as Shastriya traditions. So, why did he do so? Saraswati preferred to call the great tradition as Shastriya traditions because, as I already told you, these have been mentioned in the religious epics, they have been mentioned in the Brahmanas, in the Puranas, in the Sanskritic literature, and that is why Saraswati preferred to call these great traditions as Shastriya tradition. However, in the present day society, we can also witness great tradition in Islamic and Christian communities as well. S.C. Dubey expressed the view that the Indian cultural varieties in the Indian cultural realities are so complex to be understood through a bipolar model of great tradition and little tradition. So now, as in how I gave you the examples of Dasara for great tradition, Jallikattu for little tradition, right? And the tongue and cheek piercing ceremony of Lord Subramanya for little tradition, also the worship of Lord Shiva or Lord Ganesh for great tradition. Now you might be thinking of various other traditions which is being practiced in your region, right? So now you will have the question whether this particular celebration, this particular tradition, this particular ritual, custom, does this come under great tradition or does this come under little tradition? So during the classes, many of my students will come up such interactions asking me, ma'am, does this come under great or little tradition? So now if you notice that India is such a diverse country, it is said that in every 5 to 20 kilometers, you can find changes in food pattern, changes in the dressing habits, changes in the way people speak a particular language, right? So, for example, if you take the example of Karnataka, in Karnataka itself, though the entire state speak Kannada, you can you can see that there are slight variations in the way Kannada is spoken by a person belonging to Bangalore and a person belonging to Mysore, and further if you move northwards towards the central Karnataka like Davangere, and further towards Hubli Dharwad, or further north of Karnataka towards Gulbarga Belgaum. So you can see that though all of us speak Kannada, there are certain variations in the way that language is spoken, isn't it? So within a state, within a particular language, if we can see so much of diversity, you can understand how much are diverse, how much diversity we can observe throughout the length and breadth of a country, isn't it? So from north to south and east to west, we have so many states with different languages, with different food patterns, following different festivals, culture, traditions, practices, customs, rituals, beliefs, isn't it? So, when there is so much of diversity in an entire country, is it really possible for us to just classify the entire traditions that is present in our country into just two broad categories of great tradition and little tradition? No, it will become a daunting task, isn't it? It is not possible. There are so many traditions which neither come under great tradition, which neither come under little tradition. So there will be so many traditions which can be placed under both. So considering the diversity of a country and the diversity, the traditions, customs, festivals which we follow, what our S.C. Dubé suggested was, he says that it is not possible, that is Indian cultural realities are too complex, and it is not possible for us to classify all the culture and all the cultural elements, traditions and customs and practices into true broad categories, saying these many come under great tradition and these many come under little tradition. So that is not a possibility. This is what S.C. Dubé says. He expressed the view that the Indian cultural realities are so complex that we cannot classify all the traditions of our country into just two broad categories of great tradition and little tradition. He said that instead we can go for a multiple classification, that is, we have to have a multipolar view of tradition. This is what S.C. Dubé suggested. So he said that instead of classifying the entire traditions of our country into two broad categories, let us classify them into six categories. Okay, so he said that we can classify the traditions into six categories of classical tradition, regional tradition, local tradition, Western tradition, emergent national tradition, and subcultural tradition of special group. So what each one of these mean? We shall be discussing each one of these traditions in depth in our regular lectures. Okay, so just keep in mind that Indian cultural realities are too complex to be classified into a bipolar model of great tradition and little tradition alone. And that is why S.C. Dubé gave us a six-fold classification, saying we can classify the Indian cultural traditions into classical tradition, regional tradition, local tradition, Western tradition, emergent national tradition, and subcultural tradition of special group. So now we get this question in mind. So if there are great tradition and little tradition, is there some interactions which are going on between these traditions, or are they watertight such that there is no interaction which is happening between the great and the little tradition? No. The elements of great tradition and the little tradition influence each other. We can find that the great tradition elements will be influencing the little tradition and vice versa. That is, the little tradition elements also influence the great tradition. So, when the great tradition elements influence the little tradition, does the little tradition completely gets wiped away? No. There, the great tradition of the urban world has not displayed the little tradition, has not displaced the little tradition of the villages, but the interaction between the two, that is, the interactions between the great tradition and the little tradition, leads to fusion of the traditions and interpenetration of traditions. Okay, so now we might get the question that the great tradition are so popular, it has been mentioned in the religious text, it has a wide reach, it has a national character, it is followed by the elite people. So is it not possible that these great tradition elements will influence the little tradition and it will subdue that, or it will take over the little tradition and it will become dominant, whereas the little tradition elements will completely get washed away. So, no, that cannot happen. Each of these have their own unique role. Just like how the great tradition are associated with the allied people, urban people, the little tradition also has its unique role in the villages, among the folk people, among the rural people, among the peasant society. So the little tradition also has its role and importance, and it also exists in the rural areas. So what happens is, whenever people from the urban areas and the rural areas come together in places of worship or in other rituals or other places, there is interpenetration and there is fusion of these great tradition and little tradition happening. Got it? So some great tradition elements will migrate towards the little tradition, and some little tradition elements will migrate towards the great tradition, which will ultimately lead to the interaction, interpenetration, and fusion of the traditions. So now we can very easily witness few little tradition elements being practiced in urban areas, isn't it? Similarly, you can also find these popular festivals like Dasara, Diwali being celebrated by the folk and the rural people also, right? So what is this? This is nothing but the movement or the migration and the interpenetration and fusion of the little tradition and the great tradition. So how exactly this interpenetration and fusion happens? This we shall be discussing in our detailed lectures. Just understand that the interactions of the great tradition and the little tradition leads to the fusion and the interpenetration of the traditions. Okay, so I hope you got a clear understanding of what we mean by traditions, what is the great tradition, what is little tradition, and the concept given by Robert Redfield and how it was applied to the Indian context by McKim Marriott and Milton Singer, who gave us the concept of little tradition and great tradition, and the how is the differentiation between great tradition and little tradition, and how each of these influence each other, ultimately leading to the fusion and interpenetration of traditions. Much more in detail about the interactions of the little tradition and great tradition we shall be discussing in our comprehensive lecture on anthropology optional. Until I meet you in the next lecture, take care, bye, have a good day.